The Bohemian Basin, wrapped in gentle mountains to the north and west, highlands to the southeast, and thick forests to the southwest, has always felt like a quiet cradle of history. Long ago, Germanic tribes, the Marcomanni and the Lombards, lived in this fertile valley. They built homes along the rivers and raised families in its open plains. But time in Europe never stood still. By the 6th and 7th centuries, great migrations reshaped the land. From the marshes of what is today Belarus and Ukraine, Slavic peoples slowly moved westward. Around 550 AD, the first Slavic families reached Bohemia. They built small homes of wood and earth near the rivers, where the soil was kind and the water plentiful. Their pottery carried simple geometric designs, their tools of iron different from the Germanic ones buried deeper in the ground. They came not as conquerors, but as patient settlers. Many Germanic peoples simply drifted away, southward into Italy, or into the Lombard Confederation. The Slavic newcomers lived in close family groups, called Zadruga. They chose high places for safety, raising wooden palisades and earth walls around their villages, grads, as they were called. By the 7th century, distinct tribes had emerged. The Czechs settled along the Vltava River. Others, the Lucans, the Suvan, spread into nearby valleys. Each tribe guarded its stronghold, often overlooking river crossings and trade paths. Chiefs led their people, not as kings but as warriors, their power rooted in bravery and generosity. And then came Samo. He was a Frankish merchant, a man of trade who won the trust of Slavic tribes. In 623, during their struggles with the Avars, raiders from the steppe, he became their leader. His confederations stretched across much of Central Europe. In 631, he even defeated a Frankish king, Dagobert, at the Battle of Wolgastusberg. For a moment, the Slavs of Bohemia stood as a force strong enough to resist both nomads and Franks. But when Samo died, the alliance dissolved, and the tribes returned to their smaller worlds. Still, the memory remained that unity was possible. In the centuries that followed, legends began to form. Chroniclers told of a wise woman, Princess Libius, daughter of Judge Croc. From her hilltop court, she offered prophecies. One vision foretold the greatness of a city to be called Prague, the threshold. When her people asked for a prince, she pointed them to a humble plowman, Premisl. He left his fields and became the founder of a dynasty. Whether myth or memory, this story bound the people to the land, linking power with both prophecy and the soil itself. By the 9th century, the Pre-Mislid dynasty stepped out of legend and into history. The first ruler we can name is Bohemia I. His reign in the late 800s marked the moment Bohemia became more than a cluster of tribes. Bohemia accepted Christianity, baptized by Methodius of Great Moravia. This was no small act. It tied Bohemia to the Christian world, even as many of his people clung to their old gods. At Prague Castle, he built the first Christian church, dedicated to the Virgin Mary. The castle itself, high above the Vltava, guarded trade routes and wealth that strengthened his dynasty. After him came Spitinev, and then young Václav, known later as Wenceslas. His rule in the early 900s was fragile. Magyars swept in raids from the plains, while Saxon dukes pressed from the west. Wenceslas, gentle and devout, sought peace through diplomacy. He built churches, cared for the poor, and nurtured Christian learning. But his brother Boleslav resented him, seeing him as weak. In 929, during a feast, Boleslav struck him down at the door of a church. Wenceslas died, but in death, he became a saint, the patron of Bohemia. His cult spread quickly, giving the Premislids not only bloodline, but sanctity. Boleslav I ruled with strength. He reorganized armies, built fortresses, and resisted Saxon domination. He expanded east, into Slovakia and even toward Poland and Hungary. He balanced submission to the Holy Roman Empire with fierce autonomy. Under him, Prague grew into a center of power. His son, Boleslav II, extended the dynasty further. In 973, Bohemia gained its own bishopric in Prague, binding the land more deeply into Christian Europe. Yet, as often in Bohemian history, unity was fragile. Succession disputes divided the dynasty. Polish rulers under Boleslaw the Brave seized Krakow and even occupied Prague for a short time in 1003. Though the Przemyslids regained their throne, they did so at the cost of greater dependence on the Holy Roman Empire. Still, each challenge forced them to strengthen institutions, church, markets, and castles that would sustain them. By the 11th century, dukes like Oldrich and Bretislav I consolidated Bohemia once more. Bretislav, known as the Bohemian Achilles, expanded into Moravia and Poland. He raided Gniezno, carrying away relics of St. Adalbert. His reign marked the shift from fragile tribal duchy to a kingdom in waiting. Markets blossomed, silver mining grew, and new towns appeared. Generations later, in 1198, Ottokar I secured the royal crown, transforming Bohemia into a true kingdom recognized by emperors and popes. The Przemyslids had come far from their mythical plowmen. They were now kings of a land both sacred and powerful. And under Charles IV in the 14th century, Bohemia would even reach a golden age, Prague shining as one of Europe's great capitals. But tonight, as you drift, we leave the story here, in the early centuries, where legends blurred into history, and a valley surrounded by mountains slowly grew into a kingdom. The rivers still flowed, the castles stood silent in the night, and the people of Bohemia dreamed of futures yet to come. So close your eyes, imagine the mist over the Vltava, the sound of bells echoing through ancient forests, and the gentle voices of those long gone. The history of Bohemia rests softly, like a lullaby, carrying you deeper into sleep. The tale begins in the early 11th century, when the name of Bohemia was still spoken softly in the courts of emperors. A ruler named Bretislav I, sometimes called the Bohemian Achilles, rose to power. Strong in battle, but also steady in vision, he began reshaping his homeland into something greater than it had ever been. In the year 1039, Bretislav marched his armies north, across rivers and through forests, into the heart of Poland. His campaign was swift and fierce. Great fortresses such as Poznan and Gniezno fell before his men. But this was more than war. His forces carried away precious relics, the bones of St. Adalbert, the holy man once tied to Poland's faith. Bretislav brought them home, to Prague. There, the relics were laid to rest, with ceremonies of incense and bells. It was not only a military triumph, but a spiritual one. The message was clear: Bohemia was not just a land of warriors. It was a land chosen for greatness. Though the emperor soon forced him to release much of what he had taken, Bretislav had already made his point. Bohemia was strong again. When the fighting was over, Bretislav turned his eyes inward. Around 1039, he created laws that touched every corner of life. These statutes regulated marriages, inheritance, trade, and worship. Villagers now had common rules. Merchants found consistent measures for trade. Priests, monks, and bishops discovered their duties woven more tightly with the duke's will. It was as if Bohemia itself was being stitched together into a single garment. After Bretislav's death, his son Zbigniew too carried the torch. His years were filled with challenges, especially from the rising kingdom of Hungary. Both Hungary and Bohemia desired the same prize: influence over the lands of today's Slovakia and southern Poland. Borderlands bristled with castles. Siege engines thundered. Cavalry clashed in narrow valleys. Yet, through it all, Bohemia showed its resilience. And then came another son of Bretislav, Vratislav II. His time aligned with one of the greatest storms in Europe, the conflict between Emperor Henry IV and Pope Gregory VII, the investiture controversy. Vratislav, clever and ambitious, chose his moment. He marched with the emperor, even to Rome itself. In 1085, his loyalty was rewarded. On that day he was crowned the first king of Bohemia. The crown was heavy, gleaming with gems. Bohemia, once a duchy on the empire's edge, now stood as a recognized kingdom. A new era had begun. With royal dignity came growth. Prague blossomed into a city of stone churches, bustling markets, and noble courts. Silver mines in the mountains poured wealth into the realm. Castles rose above rivers, and monasteries filled with chanting monks preserved old Slavic hymns beside Latin prayers. But dynasties are fragile. After Vratislav, quarrels split the realm. Brothers fought brothers. Nobles schemed. Hungarians and Austrians pressed at the borders. Still, through hardship, Bohemia endured and adapted. By the mid-12th century, Vladislaus II guided his kingdom into the spotlight again. He joined the Second Crusade, sending Bohemian knights to faraway Damascus. He stood beside the mighty Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, winning recognition that Bohemia would no longer be a crown that disappeared with a single king. It would be a hereditary kingdom. For the first time, the throne of Bohemia belonged not just to a man, but to a dynasty. The century turned, and with it came the greatest of all Bohemian kings, Ottokar II, sometimes called the Iron and Golden King. Ottokar dreamed not only of ruling Bohemia, but of uniting much of Central Europe under his crown. His armies swept across Austria, Styria, Carinthia, and Carniola. Castles fell. Cities bent the knee. By the 1260s, his influence stretched from the Baltic Sea to the Adriatic coast. He was a builder as well as a conqueror. New towns were founded. Trade routes flowed through Prague, connecting northern merchants with the riches of Italy and beyond. His soldiers wielded crossbows, his engineers crafted mighty siege engines, and his court glittered with scholars and artists. For a moment, Bohemia seemed the beating heart of Europe. But empires built swiftly can crumble just as fast. Ottokar's ambition alarmed the German princes. When Rudolf of Habsburg became emperor in 1273, he moved against the Bohemian king. Alliances formed. Armies gathered. The two forces met at the Battle of Marchfeld in the summer of 1278. It was one of the largest battles Europe had seen in generations. Ottokar led from the front. His cavalry thundered into the imperial line, breaking through in places. For a moment, victory seemed near. But the Hungarian horsemen, swift and cunning, struck the flanks. Imperial knights pressed forward. The tide turned. By the end of that day, Ottokar lay dead upon the field, his empire collapsing like sand washed away by the river. Bohemia withdrew back to its heartlands. The dream of a great Central European empire was gone. Yet history does not end with a single battle. After the fall of Ottokar, dynastic struggles continued. Nobles grew stronger. Foreign claimants sought the crown. For a time, the Luxembourgs ruled, kings from a family that tied Bohemia to the wider politics of Europe. They would leave their mark, in art, in trade, in power. And so, the story of Bohemia continued, weaving triumph and loss, splendor and struggle. Now, as you drift to sleep, think of Prague's castle on its hill, shining under moonlight, its towers standing as they have for centuries. Think of the river Vltava, flowing quietly past, carrying with it the echoes of kings and crusaders, monks and merchants, battles and coronations. The kingdom of Bohemia, a land of crowns and castles, of victories and defeats, forever etched into the heart of Europe. These administrative arrangements generated resentment among nobles who expected direct access to royal decision-making while creating opportunities for corruption and mismanagement that weakened the kingdom's financial resources. John's Italian campaigns demonstrated the military capabilities that would make him one of Europe's most celebrated knights while revealing the costs associated with sustained military operations in distant territories. The forces participated in the complex conflicts between papal authority and imperial claims in northern Italy, where Bohemian heavy cavalry proved particularly effective in the siege warfare that characterized most military operations. The campaigns provided John with valuable combat experience and international recognition while generating substantial costs that strained Bohemian financial resources and created domestic political tensions. The Siege of Brescia in 1311 showcased both John's personal courage and the tactical innovations the Bohemian forces had developed during their Italian service. Bohemian engineers constructed sophisticated siege works that employed counterweight trebuchets and specialized undermining techniques to breach the city's formidable fortifications. The successful capture of Brescia after a prolonged siege demonstrated Bohemian military competence while providing substantial booty that partially offset campaign expenses. Archaeological investigations at Brescia have revealed evidence of the siege works, including stone projectiles and metal fragments from Bohemian siege engines. The Bohemian involvement in imperial politics intensified following Henry VII's death in 1313 and John's subsequent support for his brother-in-law Charles of France during the complex succession disputes that followed. These diplomatic commitments required substantial military contributions that further strained Bohemian resources while providing limited direct benefits to the kingdom's territorial or commercial interests. John's forces participated in several major battles in France and the Low Countries where their military reputation enhanced Luxembourg prestige while creating financial obligations that would plague Bohemian administration for decades. The domestic opposition that emerged during John's frequent absences reflected both specific grievances regarding taxation and military service and broader concerns about the kingdom's strategic direction under foreign dynastic rule. Noble assemblies began asserting greater authority over royal policy decisions, particularly regarding military commitments that required substantial financial contributions from Bohemian territories. These constitutional developments establish precedents for noble participation in governmental decision-making that would influence Bohemian political development throughout the Luxembourg period. The rebellion led by Henry of Lippe in 1315 represented the most serious challenge to John's authority and revealed the extent of noble dissatisfaction with Luxembourg rule. Henry's forces controlled substantial territories in northern Bohemia while maintaining diplomatic relationships with Polish and Hungarian rulers who provided military assistance in exchange for territorial concessions. The rebellion's initial success demonstrated both the military capabilities that discontented nobles could mobilize and the weakness of royal authority when the king remained absent from the kingdom for extended periods. John's return to Bohemia in 1316 to address the rebellion showcased his military talents in domestic contexts while revealing his capacity for political compromise when circumstances required accommodation rather than confrontation. His forces employed sophisticated siege techniques to reduce rebel strongholds while his diplomatic initiatives offered amnesty and compensation to nobles who abandoned the rebellion. The successful resolution of the crisis strengthened royal authority while establishing precedents for noble participation in governmental administration that would characterize subsequent Luxembourg rule. The economic policies implemented following the rebellion suppression reflected John's recognition of the need to balance international military commitments with domestic resource requirements. New taxation systems were established that provided more predictable revenues, while reducing the arbitrary levies that had generated noble opposition. These fiscal reforms included standardized assessment procedures and regular collection schedules that improved governmental efficiency while providing nobles with greater certainty regarding their financial obligations. The reforms also established new commercial regulations that enhanced trade revenues while protecting merchant interests that had suffered during the political instability. The expansion of silver mining operations during the 1320s provided John with the financial resources necessary to pursue renewed military campaigns while maintaining domestic political stability. New extraction techniques, borrowed from German mining experts, enabled more efficient exploitation of Bohemian silver deposits while reducing production costs. The increased silver production generated substantial revenues that funded both military expeditions and domestic infrastructure projects, creating economic conditions that supported continued Luxembourg rule. Despite ongoing concerns about the dynasty's international commitments, John's participation in the crusading movement reflected both his personal religious convictions and his strategic understanding of the diplomatic advantages that crusading service could provide for ambitious rulers seeking to enhance their international reputations. His involvement in the Prussian Crusades during the 1320s brought Bohemian forces into contact with the Teutonic Knights, while providing opportunities for territorial expansion in regions that had previously remained outside Central European political influence. These campaigns demonstrated Bohemian military capabilities in Baltic conditions while establishing diplomatic relationships that would prove valuable during subsequent conflicts. The Lithuanian campaigns that occupied much of John's attention during the 1330s represented some of the most challenging military operations undertaken by medieval Bohemian forces, requiring adaptation to forest warfare conditions and enemy tactics that differed substantially from conventional Western European military practices. Bohemian forces employed specialized equipment, including portable bridges for river crossings and modified siege engines adapted to woodland conditions. The campaigns achieved limited territorial gains while providing valuable military experience that enhanced Bohemian capabilities in unconventional warfare situations. The growing tensions with France during the 1330s created diplomatic complications that would ultimately lead to John's death at sea while demonstrating the complex international relationships that Luxembourg rule had created for Bohemia. John's alliance obligations to France required military service against English forces during the opening phases of what would become the 100 Years' War, commitments that placed Bohemian forces in conflicts that had little direct relevance to the kingdom's strategic interests. These military obligations reflected both the advantages and disadvantages of the international connections that Luxembourg dynastic rule had established. The Battle of Cra on August 26, 1346, represented both the culmination of Jay's military career and the tragic consequences of chivalric idealism. When confronted with innovative military technologies and tactics, despite being nearly blind from previous injuries sustained during his numerous military campaigns, John insisted on participating personally in the cavalry charges against English positions. His decision to fight despite his physical limitations reflected both personal courage and adherence to chivalric codes that valued honor above practical considerations of military effectiveness or dynastic continuity. The English longbowmen at Cray employed tactical innovations that proved devastatingly effective against traditional heavy cavalry charges, creating circumstances where individual courage and martial skill provided little advantage against mass archery fire. John's forces fighting alongside French knights encountered withering volleys of arrows that decimated their ranks before they could engage in close combat where their superior armor and weapons would have provided advantages. Archaeological evidence from the battlefield includes numerous arrowheads and armor fragments that demonstrate the intensity of the archery bombardment that determined the battle's outcome. John's death during the final cavalry charges eliminated one of Europe's most experienced military commanders while creating succession circumstances that would enable his son Charles to transform Bohemia into the political and cultural center of Central Europe. The discovery of John's body among the fallen, identified by the distinctive Luxembourg heraldry on his surcoat, confirmed both his personal participation in the combat and his adherence to chivalric principles that prioritized honor over survival. His death symbolized both the end of an era of Bohemian military adventurism and the beginning of a period focused on internal development and imperial ambitions. The immediate succession of Charles IV to the Bohemian throne in 1346 coincided with his election as Holy Roman Emperor, creating unprecedented opportunities for Bohemian influence within the imperial system while establishing Prague as a major center of European politics. Charles's educational background, which included extensive study in Paris and administrative experience in Italy, provided him with sophisticated understanding of contemporary governmental practices and diplomatic relationships that would prove crucial during his transformation of Bohemia into an imperial capital. His multilingual abilities and cultural knowledge enabled effective communication with diverse populations throughout his territories while facilitating the international relationships necessary for sustained imperial authority. The transfer of the imperial capital from traditional German centers to Prague represented one of the most significant political developments in 14th century Europe and demonstrated Charles's vision of Bohemia's potential role within the broader imperial system. The decision required substantial investment in architectural projects and administrative infrastructure that would accommodate the governmental apparatus necessary for imperial administration while providing appropriate settings for the ceremonial activities that legitimized imperial authority. Archaeological evidence from Prague Castle reveals extensive construction projects initiated during Charles's early reign, including new residential quarters, administrative buildings, and ceremonial spaces designed to rival the imperial centers of previous centuries. The architectural transformation of Prague under Charles's patronage created one of Europe's most impressive urban centers while demonstrating the kingdom's cultural sophistication and economic capabilities. The construction of St. Vitus Cathedral began in 1344, employed master craftsmen from throughout Europe while incorporating architectural innovations that reflected contemporary developments in Gothic design. The cathedral's elaborate facade, sophisticated structural systems, and extensive sculptural programs created a religious setting appropriate for imperial coronations while providing adequate space for the growing number of pilgrims visiting Bohemian religious sites. The foundation of Charles University in 1348 established the first university in Central Europe and created an institutional center for scholarly activity that attracted students and faculty from throughout the continent. The university's curriculum included traditional subjects of theology, law, and medicine while incorporating newer disciplines that reflected contemporary intellectual developments. The establishment of separate colleges. 4 different linguistic groups enabled effective instruction for the diverse student population while maintaining academic standards that rivaled those of established universities in Paris and Oxford. The university's library, established through royal patronage and private donations, preserved important manuscripts while supporting scholarly research that enhanced Bohemia's intellectual reputation. Construction of Charles Bridge, begun in 1357, represented both a remarkable engineering achievement and a symbol of Prague's transformation into a major European capital. The bridge's sophisticated design employed advanced construction techniques that enabled it to withstand the Vltava rivers seasonal flooding while providing adequate capacity for the increased commercial traffic that imperial status had generated. The bridge's decorative elements, including elaborate sculptural programs and architectural details, demonstrated the artistic capabilities that royal patronage had fostered while creating a distinctive urban landmark that enhanced Prague's international reputation. The cultural flowering that characterized Charles's reign attracted artists, scholars, and craftsmen from throughout Europe, while fostering distinctive Bohemian traditions in manuscript illumination, architectural design, and religious art. The royal court became a center of international cultural exchange, where different artistic traditions merged to create new forms of expression that influenced artistic development throughout Central Europe. The court's patronage of manuscript production resulted in illuminated texts that combined traditional Bohemian decorative elements with contemporary European artistic innovations, creating works that demonstrated both technical excellence and cultural sophistication. The administrative reforms implemented during Charles's reign created governmental structures capable of managing the expanded territories under Bohemian control while maintaining the efficiency necessary for effective imperial administration. New bureaucratic procedures standardize record-keeping practices while establishing clear hierarchies of authority that enabled effective coordination between different administrative levels. These reforms included the establishment of written legal codes that clarified judicial procedures while protecting traditional noble privileges within the framework of enhanced royal authority. The economic policies that supported Charles's architectural and cultural projects reflected sophisticated understanding of the relationship between commercial development and political authority. New trade agreements with Italian city-states and Flemish commercial centers enhanced Prague's position as a major commercial hub while generating customs revenues that funded continued construction projects. The regulation of craft production through guild systems ensured quality standards while providing additional tax revenues that supported governmental expansion. These economic developments created urban prosperity that attracted additional population while generating the wealth necessary for sustained cultural patronage. The succession of Benuslas IV in 1378 coincided with the beginning of the Western Schism and created circumstances that would test both Bohemian governmental institutions and the kingdom's position within the broader European political system. Wenceslas inherited substantial territorial holdings and well-developed administrative systems, but he also faced challenges created by the Papal Schism, growing religious tensions within Bohemia, and noble opposition to policies that had concentrated authority in royal hands. His reign would reveal both the strengths and weaknesses of the governmental structures that Charles had created while establishing the preconditions for the religious crisis that would dominate early 15th century Bohemian politics. The religious tensions that had been building throughout Vince's reign reached a critical juncture with the emergence of Jan Hus as a prominent voice for ecclesiastical reform and Czech national identity. Appointed rector of Prague University in 1409, had absorbed the theological writings of John Wycliffe during his studies and began advocating for fundamental changes in church practices that resonated deeply with both scholarly circles and ordinary Bohemians. Frustrated by clerical corruption, his sermons at Bethlehem Chapel, delivered in Czech rather than Latin, attracted audiences that included nobles, burghers, and craftsmen who had grown increasingly resentful of the wealth and moral failings displayed by many church officials. The theological positions that Huss developed during his tenure at Prague University challenged fundamental assumptions about ecclesiastical authority while appealing to Czech national sentiments that had been fostered by decades of cultural development under Charles IV. The treatises argued that the true church consisted of the predestined faithful rather than the institutional hierarchy, that papal authority derived from moral worthiness rather than apostolic succession, and that Scripture should be accessible to ordinary believers in their native language. These ideas struck at the heart of medieval church organization while providing intellectual justification for Czech resistance to German ecclesiastical dominance that had characterized Bohemian religious life since the establishment of the Prague bishopric. The Council of Constance convened in 1414 to resolve the Western Schism and address growing calls for church reform throughout Europe. Provided Huss's opponents with an opportunity to eliminate his influence while demonstrating their commitment to ecclesiastical orthodoxy. Emperor Sigismund, who had inherited the Bohemian crown following his brother Venislaus's death in 1419, issued a safe conduct guarantee that promised protection during his journey to Constance and participation in the council's proceedings. This imperial protection reflected both Sigismund's desire to resolve religious tensions within his territories and his confidence that concilia authorities would handle the controversy in ways that strengthened rather than weakened established church structures. Huss's arrival in Constance in November 1414 marked the beginning of proceedings that would transform a theological dispute into a catalyst for revolutionary upheaval throughout Central Europe. The safe conduct that Sigismund had provided proved worthless when conciliar authorities arrested shortly after his arrival, arguing that imperial guarantees could not protect heretics from ecclesiastical justice. The arrest violated both imperial authority and diplomatic conventions while demonstrating the council's determination to eliminate reform movements that threatened established church hierarchy. Archaeological evidence from Constance includes remains of the prison where was held, revealing the harsh conditions that characterized his 8-month incarceration before trial. The trial proceedings that began in June 1415 revealed the fundamental incompatibility between Huss's theological positions and the ecclesiastical orthodoxy that conciliar authorities sought to maintain. The charges against included denial of papal supremacy, advocacy of communion in both kinds for lay believers, and promotion of vernacular religious services that undermined clerical authority. The trial transcripts preserved in concilia archives demonstrate both the sophisticated theological arguments that Huss presented in his defense and the predetermined nature of proceedings designed to secure his condemnation rather than engage seriously with reform proposals. Thus, refusal to recount his theological positions during the final trial session on July 6, 1415, sealed his fate while providing Czech reformers with a martyred leader whose death would inspire decades of religious warfare. His final statement to the council affirmed his commitment to scriptural authority over human traditions while expressing confidence that future generations would vindicate his theological positions. The execution that followed immediately after his condemnation employed the traditional method of burning with Huss's ashes. scattered in the Rhine River to prevent the collection of relics that might inspire continued devotion to his memory. News of Huss's execution reached Prague in late July 1415 and provoked immediate outrage among university scholars, noble supporters, and ordinary citizens who had followed his teachings. The violation of imperial safe-conduct guarantees particularly enraged Czech nobles who viewed Sigismund's failure to protect H as both a betrayal of imperial honor and evidence of German contempt for Czech interests. Public demonstrations in Prague included the burning of papal bulls and the destruction of property belonging to clergy who had supported Huss's condemnation, while university masters issued formal protests that condemned both the trial procedures and the execution itself. The religious ferment that followed Huss's death crystallized around the 4 Articles of Prague formulated in 1420 as a comprehensive statement of Czech reform demands that would guide the revolutionary movement throughout the subsequent wars. The first article demanded freedom of preaching throughout Bohemian territories, challenging the church hierarchy's control over religious instruction while establishing the principle that qualified individuals could interpret Scripture regardless of their ordination status. This provision reflected both Hussite theological convictions and practical recognition that many parish priests lacked the education necessary for effective pastoral care. The second article required communion in both kinds for all believers, eliminating the distinction between clerical and lay communion that had symbolized ecclesiastical hierarchy. Throughout medieval Christianity, this demand carried profound symbolic significance beyond its theological implications, representing Czech rejection of German religious dominance, while asserting the spiritual equality of all believers. Archaeological evidence from Hussite churches reveals the construction of new altar arrangements designed to accommodate communion in both kinds, including expanded sanctuary spaces and specialized vessels for wine distribution to large congregations. The third article called for the elimination of clerical property ownership and temporal authority, arguing that priests should live in apostolic poverty while focusing exclusively on spiritual duties. This provision targeted the extensive land holdings that had made the Bohemian Church one of the kingdom's wealthiest institutions while addressing popular resentment of clerical involvement in secular politics. The implementation of this article would require massive redistribution of church properties that comprised approximately 1/3 of Bohemian agricultural land, creating economic incentives for noble support of the Hussite movement. The fourth article demanded punishment for mortal sins regardless of the perpetrator's social status, challenging the legal immunities that had protected clerical criminals while expressing broader demands for social justice. This provision reflected popular anger at clerical corruption while asserting principles of legal equality that contradicted medieval social hierarchies. The article's implementation would require fundamental changes in legal procedures and judicial authority that extended far beyond religious reform to encompass comprehensive social transformation. The first defenestration of Prague on July 30, 1419 transformed religious protest into open rebellion while establishing violent precedents that would characterize subsequent Hussite resistance to Catholic authority. The incident began as a procession led by radical preacher Jan Zalivky to demand the release of Hussite prisoners held in Prague's new town hall. When municipal authorities refused to comply with these demands, the crowd forced entry into the building and threw several Catholic councillors from upper-story windows onto the pikes of supporters gathered below. The defenestration eliminated Catholic political leadership in Prague while demonstrating Hussite willingness to employ extreme violence against their opponents. The immediate aftermath of the defenestration witnessed the collapse of royal authority in Prague as Hussite radicals seized control of municipal government and began implementing religious reforms throughout the city. Catholic clergy fled to safer territories while their properties were confiscated and redistributed among Hussite supporters. The city's churches were purged of religious images and decorations that has sites considered idolatrous, with valuable items sold to fund military preparations, while architectural modifications accommodated new liturgical practices. Archaeological investigations of Prague churches have revealed extensive evidence of this iconoclastic campaign, including damaged sculptures and altered altar arrangements. King Weslaus' death in August 1419, reportedly triggered by apoplexy upon learning of the defenestration, eliminated the last hope for peaceful resolution of religious tensions while creating succession circumstances that would legitimize armed resistance to Catholic authority. His brother Sigismund's claim to the Bohemian throne faced immediate rejection from Hussite nobles who viewed him as responsible for Huss's death and feared that his rule would bring systematic persecution of Czech reformers. The succession crisis provided Hussites with legal justification for their rebellion while creating opportunities for territorial expansion that would transform religious conflict into comprehensive social revolution. The Hussite military organization that emerged during the winter of 1419 to 1420 represented one of the most innovative developments in medieval warfare, combining religious motivation with tactical innovations that would influence military development throughout Europe. The movement's early leaders included minor nobles and urban professionals who possessed sufficient education to understand complex theological arguments, while maintaining connections with ordinary craftsmen and farmers who provided the movement's numerical threat. This social composition enabled Hussite forces to combine aristocratic military expertise with popular enthusiasm in ways that proved devastatingly effective against traditional feudal armies. Yancey Tronov emerged as the movement's most capable military commander, bringing extensive combat experience from previous service in royal armies, while demonstrating exceptional talent for innovative tactics and strategic planning. His background included participation in the Battle of Grunwald in 1410, where he had observed the effectiveness of disciplined infantry formations against heavy cavalry charges. Ziska's early Hussite campaigns revealed his understanding of the movement's military limitations while showcasing his ability to transform apparent weaknesses into tactical advantages that confounded enemy expectations. The war wagon formations that became synonymous with Hussite military success represented Ziska's most significant tactical innovation, creating mobile fortifications that provided protection for infantry forces while maintaining the flexibility necessary for offensive operations. These wagons, constructed according to standardized designs that enabled rapid deployment and effective coordination, incorporated iron reinforcements and specialized weapon mounts that transformed ordinary transport vehicles into formidable military equipment. The wagon's crews included crossbowmen, handgunners, and flail-wielding infantry, who could deliver devastating firepower while remaining protected from cavalry charges that had traditionally dominated medieval battlefields. The Battle of Suder on March 25, 1420, provided the first major demonstration of war wagon effectiveness while establishing Ziska's reputation as one of Europe's most innovative military commanders. His forces, numbering fewer than 400 men, faced a Catholic army of approximately 2,000 troops that included experienced knights and professional soldiers confident in their ability to crush peasant rebels. The Hussite Deployment created a wagon fortress on elevated ground that channeled enemy attacks into predetermined killing zones, where crossbow and early firearm vols could achieve maximum effectiveness against armored opponents. The Catholic assault on the wagon fortress revealed the fundamental tactical problems that traditional heavy cavalry faced when confronting well-prepared defensive positions equipped with missile weapons. The knights' charges, which had proven decisive in countless previous battles, became suicidal attacks against protected infantry who could reload and fire repeatedly while remaining safe from retaliation. The battle's outcome demonstrated the disciplined common soldiers armed with appropriate weapons could defeat the military elite that had dominated European warfare for centuries, encouraging similar tactical innovations throughout the continent. The Siege of Prague in 1420 by Sigismund's forces provided Žižka with opportunities to demonstrate war wagon effectiveness in defensive operations while revealing the broader strategic implications of height military innovations. The imperial army, which included contingents from throughout the Holy Roman Empire, employed traditional siege techniques that proved inadequate against defenders who could sortie from the city using mobile wagon fortresses that provided protection during withdrawal. The siege's failure after several months of ineffective operations demonstrated both Hussite defensive capabilities and the inadequacy of conventional military methods against innovative opponents. The Hussite counterattacks that followed the siege's collapse extended their territorial control throughout Bohemia while demonstrating the offensive potential of war wagon tactics when properly coordinated with cavalry and infantry support. Žižka's forces captured numerous Catholic strongholds through systematic campaigns that combined siege warfare with mobile operations designed to prevent enemy reinforcement or relief. These victories provided Hussites with substantial military resources while eliminating Catholic bases that had threatened their territorial consolidation. The development of Hussite artillery capabilities represented another significant military innovation that enhanced their siege warfare effectiveness while demonstrating their ability to adapt contemporary military technology to their specific tactical requirements. Hussite foundries produced cannon designs that emphasized mobility and rapid deployment rather than the massive siege guns that characterized contemporary artillery development. These weapons could be transported with war wagon formations, while providing sufficient firepower to breach medieval fortifications that lack the architectural modifications necessary to withstand gunpowder weapons. The Battle of Vico Hill on July 14, 1420 showcased the defensive potential of combined war wagon and artillery tactics while providing Žižka with his most celebrated victory against overwhelming numerical foes. The Hussite position, fortified with wagon barriers and artillery placements, faced assault by Sigismund's entire army in a desperate attempt to capture Prague through elimination of its primary defensive outpost. The battle's outcome demonstrated that properly prepared positions could withstand massive assaults while inflicting casualties that made continued siege operations impossible. The death of Jan Žižka in 1424 eliminated the Hussite movement's most capable military leader while creating succession disputes that would fragment their forces and reduce their military effectiveness. His followers who adopted the name orphans to commemorate their loss continued employing the tactical innovations he had developed while struggling to maintain the strategic vision that had guided earlier campaigns. The fragmentation of Hussite military leadership into competing factions reduced their ability to coordinate large-scale operations while creating opportunities for Catholic forces to exploit internal divisions. The Great emerged as Žižka's most capable successor, combining military competence with political skills that enabled him to maintain Hussite unity during the movement's most challenging period. Background included university education and administrative experience that provided him with broader perspectives on the political implications of military operations, while his personal charisma enabled him to command respect from diverse Huss factions. Prokop's leadership during the 1420s and early 1430s demonstrated both the continued effectiveness of Hussite military methods and the growing challenges posed by sustained warfare against superior enemy resources. The Great Moravian Campaign of 1423 to 1424 under Prup's leadership extended Hussite influence beyond traditional Bohemian boundaries while demonstrating their capacity for sustained offensive operations in foreign territories. The campaign's success in capturing major Moravian strongholds revealed both Hussite military capabilities and the weakness of Catholic defenses in regions where local populations sympathize with reform movements. Archaeological evidence from captured Moravian castles shows extensive modifications made during Hittite occupation, including the construction of artillery positions and the elimination of religious imagery that conflicted with Hussite theological positions. The international expeditions that characterized the later 1420s represented the peak of Hussite military success while revealing the movement's transformation from defensive rebellion into aggressive expansion that threatened Catholic Europe's stability. Hussite armies penetrated deep into Austria, Bavaria, and Saxony, conducting systematic raids that generated substantial booty while demonstrating their ability to project power far beyond Bohemian territories. These campaigns created international coalitions against Hussite expansion, while providing them with resources necessary for continued military operations. The gradual exhaustion that characterized Hussite warfare during the early 1430s reflected both the enormous costs associated with sustained military operations and the movement's internal divisions regarding war aims and negotiation possibilities. The radical Taborite faction centered in their fortified city of Tabor advocated continued warfare until complete victory over Catholic forces, while moderate Hussites increasingly favored negotiated settlements that would preserve their religious reforms within acceptable political frameworks. These divisions weakened Hussite military effectiveness while creating opportunities for Catholic diplomatic initiatives designed to exploit internal disagreements. The Council of Basil's decision to engage in serious negotiations with Hussite representatives marked a fundamental shift in Catholic strategy, from military suppression to diplomatic accommodation that recognized the impossibility of eliminating Hussite influence through force alone. The Council's invitation to Hussite theologians to present their positions before ecclesiastical authorities represented unprecedented recognition of heretical movements' legitimacy while creating opportunities for compromise solutions that might preserve church unity. The negotiations that began in 1433 would ultimately produce the Compact Tat-Ader agreement that ended the major phase of Hussite warfare while establishing precedents for religious accommodation that would influence European development for centuries. The Compact Ardor of 1436 negotiated between moderate Hussite representatives and the Council of Basel represented a remarkable compromise that preserved essential Hussite religious practices while restoring Bohemia's relationship with the broader Catholic Church. The agreement granted Bohemians the right to communion in both kinds, limited clerical property ownership, and permitted vernacular religious services while requiring acknowledgement of papal authority and acceptance of Catholic theological positions on contested doctrines. These provisions satisfied moderate Hussite demands while providing Catholic authorities with face-saving formulas that enabled them to claim victory over heretical movements. The implementation of the Compact Charta required careful attention to the concerns of radical Hussite factions who viewed any accommodation with Catholic authority as the betrayal of their martyred leader's legacy. The Battle of Lipany on May 30, 1434, where moderate Hussites allied with Catholic forces to defeat Taborite radicals, demonstrated both the depth of internal Hussite divisions and the determination of moderate leaders to pursue negotiated solutions regardless of radical opposition. The battle's outcome eliminated the most intransigent opponents of compromise while clearing the way for the diplomatic agreements that would restore stability to Bohemian territories. Georgia Pottery's emergence as the dominant figure in post-war Bohemian politics reflected both his military capabilities and his sophisticated understanding of the diplomatic relationships necessary for sustained peace with Catholic neighbors. His early career included service in Hussite armies where he had demonstrated competence in both conventional and war wagon tactics while developing political connections that would prove crucial during his subsequent rise to power. George's appointment as regent for the young Ladislaus Postuus provided him with opportunities to implement administrative reforms while maintaining the religious compromises that had ended the Hussite wars. The restoration of royal authority under George's regency required careful balance between Hussite religious autonomy and the political relationships necessary for international recognition of Bohemian legitimacy. His policies maintained the essential provisions of the Compacta while demonstrating Bohemian commitment to peaceful coexistence with Catholic neighbors. The reconstruction of war-damaged territories proceeded systematically under royal supervision with new settlements established to replace communities destroyed during the conflicts while existing towns received privileges that encouraged commercial recovery and population growth. Georgia Padera's death in March 1471 created a succession crisis that would fundamentally alter Bohemia's political trajectory and mark the beginning of foreign dynastic rule that would persist for centuries. The Bohemian Diet, faced with choosing between George's son, Henry of Terry, and external candidates, ultimately rejected the principle of hereditary succession in favor of elective monarchy that would theoretically preserve greater noble autonomy. This decision reflected the Diet's determination to prevent the concentration of royal authority that had characterized the Luxembourg period, while maintaining the religious settlements that had ended the Hussite wars. The nobles' choice of Władysław Jagiellon, son of Polish King Casimir IV, demonstrated their preference for a foreign ruler who would depend on their support rather than establish dynastic legitimacy. Władysław's election in May 1471 represented a calculated compromise between competing noble factions who sought to maximize their influence while avoiding the internal conflicts that had plagued previous succession disputes. The electoral agreement established unprecedented limitations on royal authority requiring Diet approval for major policy decisions including taxation, military campaigns, and territorial grants. These constitutional restrictions reflected the nobles' determination to prevent royal absolutism while ensuring their continued dominance over Bohemian political structures. The new king's youth and unfamiliarity with Bohemian political traditions made him particularly dependent on noble guidance, creating circumstances that would fundamentally weaken royal prerogatives throughout his reign. The constitutional arrangements negotiated during Władysław's election established the Bohemian Diet as the kingdom's dominant political institution, with expanded authority over fiscal policy, military organization, and administrative appointments. The Diet's composition reflected the social changes that had occurred during the Hussite period, with representation expanded beyond traditional noble estates to include wealthy burghers from major towns who'd gained political influence through their financial contributions to royal revenues. This broader representation created new dynamics within the Diet, as urban representatives often pursued commercial interests that conflicted with traditional noble priorities regarding territorial expansion and military expenditure. The religious settlement that accompanied Vladislas's accession required careful navigation between Catholic restoration and preservation of Hussite rights that had been guaranteed by the Compactator. The new king's Catholic faith created immediate tensions with Hussite nobles, who feared systematic persecution of their religious practices, while Catholic minorities hoped for restoration of traditional ecclesiastical authority. Vladislaus's early policies attempted to maintain the delicate balance established during George Terridy's regency, confirming Hussite communion practices while appointing Catholic administrators to key governmental positions. The compromises satisfied neither religious faction completely while creating ongoing tensions that would influence Bohemian politics throughout the Jagiellonian period. The economic challenges that confronted Vladislaus's administration reflected both the long-term consequences of the Hussite wars and changing international commercial patterns that reduced Bohemia's traditional trade advantages. The kingdom's silver mining operations, which had provided substantial revenues during the 14th century, faced declining production due to exhausted deposits and inadequate investment in new extraction technologies. Agricultural productivity remained below pre-war levels in many regions where population losses had not been fully recovered, while craft production struggled to compete with goods manufactured in Italian and Flemish centers that had developed more efficient production methods during Bohemia's period of internal conflict. The fiscal crisis that developed during the early 1470s demonstrated the fundamental weakness of royal authority under the new constitutional arrangements, as the Diet's control over taxation prevented systematic revenue collection, while noble exemptions reduced the tax base available for governmental operations. Traditional sources of royal income, including customs duties and mining revenues, proved insufficient to support both domestic administration and the military forces necessary for territorial defense. The resulting financial constraints forced Vladislaus to rely increasingly on noble cooperation for basic governmental functions, further weakening royal authority while strengthening the Diet's position as the kingdom's effective governing body. The military challenges that emerged during this period revealed the deterioration of Bohemian defensive capabilities that had occurred following the end of systematic warfare against external enemies. The professional forces that had characterized Hussite military organization had been largely disbanded following the Compacta, while the noble levies that replaced them lacked both the training and equipment necessary for effective resistance against well-organized enemies. The kingdom's fortifications, many of which had been damaged during the Hussite wars, required substantial investment for restoration, while new military technologies demanded expensive artillery and firearms that strained limited royal resources. The Hungarian succession crisis that followed the death of Matthias Corvinus in 1490 provided Vladislaus with unprecedented opportunities for territorial expansion while creating military obligations that would strain Bohemian resources for decades. The Hungarian Diet's decision to elect Vladislaus as their king established a personal union between Bohemia and Hungary that theoretically doubled the territories under Jagiellonian authority. However, this expansion came at enormous cost, as Hungarian territories faced constant Ottoman pressure along their southern frontiers, requiring military resources that Bohemia could ill afford while providing limited direct benefits to Bohemian commercial or strategic interests. The administrative challenges posed by governing two kingdoms with different legal traditions, religious compositions, and strategic priorities revealed the limitations of medieval governmental structures when confronted with expanded territorial responsibilities. Vladislaus established separate administrative systems for each kingdom while attempting to coordinate policies that affected both territories, creating bureaucratic complexities that strained available personnel while generating conflicts between competing national interests. The king's frequent absences from Bohemia to address Hungarian affairs weakened royal authority in Prague while enabling the Diet to assert greater control over domestic policies. The Ottoman expansion into Hungarian territories during the 1490s created military pressures that would dominate Jagiellonian policy for the remainder of Ladislaus's reign while demonstrating the kingdom's inadequate preparation for sustained warfare against a sophisticated enemy. Ottoman forces employed advanced siege techniques, disciplined infantry formations, and superior artillery that proved devastatingly effective against Hungarian fortifications. Designed to resist medieval rather than early modern military technologies. The systematic Ottoman conquest of Hungarian border fortresses eliminated defensive barriers that had protected Central Europe for centuries while creating refugee populations that strained resources throughout the region. The Battle of Kbava Field in 1493, where Ottoman forces destroyed a major Croatian army, demonstrated both the effectiveness of Ottoman military organization and the inadequacy of traditional Central European defensive strategies against early modern warfare. The Croatian defeat eliminated one of Hungary's most important defensive barriers while providing Ottoman forces with secure bases for further expansion into Hungarian heartlands. Archaeological evidence from the battlefield reveals the extensive use of firearms by Ottoman forces, including early muskets and artillery pieces that gave them decisive advantages over Croatian forces equipped primarily with traditional medieval weapons. The peasant unrest that characterized the late 15th and early 16th centuries reflected both the economic pressures created by increased taxation to fund military operations and the social tensions generated by noble efforts to expand their authority at peasant expense. The Bohemian peasantry, which had gained certain rights during the Hussite period, faced systematic efforts to reduce their legal status and increased their labor obligations to noble landlords. These pressures generated sporadic rebellions throughout Bohemian territories, with peasant bands attacking noble estates and destroying records of feudal obligations that had been imposed during the post-Dite settlement. The Slovak peasant revolt of 1514 led by Georgi Dasa represented the most serious challenge to noble authority during this period and revealed the extent of social tensions that had developed throughout the Hungarian territories under Jagiellonian rule. The revolt began as a crusading expedition against Ottoman forces but transformed into a comprehensive assault on noble privileges and feudal obligations. Dasa's forces captured numerous noble strongholds while implementing radical social reforms that eliminated feudal distinctions and redistributed noble properties among peasant supporters. The revolt's initial success demonstrated both popular discontent with existing social arrangements and the military potential of organized peasant forces when properly led and motivated. The suppression of Dasa's revolt required extensive military operations that revealed both the nobility's determination to preserve their privileges and their dependence on royal authority for protection against popular uprisings. The combined forces of Hungarian and Croatian nobles supported by professional soldiers funded through emergency taxation eventually defeated the peasant armies through superior equipment and coordination. The brutal repression that followed the revolt's collapse included mass executions and the implementation of harsh legal codes that further restricted peasant rights while strengthening noble authority over rural populations. The constitutional changes implemented following the peasant revolt reflected noble determination to prevent future challenges to their authority while reducing royal power that might be used to support popular movements. The Tripartitum legal code promulgated in 1514 systematically codified noble privileges while reducing peasant rights to levels that approach serfdom in many regions. These legal changes strengthened noble control over agricultural production while reducing the tax base available for royal revenues, creating fiscal constraints that would plague subsequent rulers throughout the early 16th century. Vladislaus's death in 1516 brought his 10-year-old son Louis II to the throne during a period of unprecedented crisis as Ottoman forces prepared for systematic conquest of Hungarian territories while internal divisions weakened the kingdom's defensive capabilities. The regency established for the young king reflected the political compromises that had characterized his father's reign. With authority divided among competing noble factions who pursued their own interests rather than coordinated national policies, the regency's inability to implement effective military reforms or generate adequate revenues for territorial defense created circumstances that would prove catastrophic when Ottoman forces launched their final assault on Hungarian independence. The Ottoman military preparations that characterized Sulian the Magnificent's early reign demonstrated the systematic approach that would enable their conquest of Hungarian territories despite determined resistance from local populations. Ottoman forces employed advanced logistic systems that enabled sustained operations far from their base territories, while their artillery capabilities provided decisive advantages in siege warfare against fortifications that not been modernized to resist gunpowder weapons. The recruitment of experienced European military engineers and artillery specialists enhanced Ottoman capabilities while their diplomatic initiatives isolated Hungary from potential allies who might have provided effective assistance. The siege of Belgrade in 1521 revealed both Ottoman military superiority and Hungarian defensive weaknesses that would characterize subsequent military encounters between the two powers. The fortress, which had successfully resisted previous Ottoman assaults, fell after a brief siege that demonstrated the effectiveness of Ottoman artillery against medieval fortifications. The capture of Belgrade eliminated Hungary's primary defensive barrier along the Danube River while providing Ottoman forces with secure bases for further expansion into Hungarian heartlands. Archaeological investigations at Belgrade have revealed extensive evidence of the siege, including cannonballs and structural damage that demonstrate the intensity of the bombardment that determined the fortress's fate. The Hungarian Diet's desperate attempts to organize effective resistance during the early 1520s revealed both the kingdom's military potential and the political divisions that prevented effective coordination of defensive efforts. The Diet authorized substantial tax increases to fund military preparations while negotiating with potential allies, including the Holy Roman Empire and Poland, for military assistance against Ottoman expansion. However, these efforts came too late to address the fundamental weaknesses in Hungarian military organization. Internal political conflicts prevented effective implementation of defensive strategies. The marriage negotiations between Louis II and Mary of Austria, completed in 1515, represented the Hungarian Diet's attempt to secure Habsburg military support against Ottoman expansion while maintaining Hungarian independence under Jagiellonian rule. The marriage created diplomatic relationships with the Habsburg family that theoretically provided access to imperial military resources. While the reciprocal marriage between Archduke Ferdinand and Louis's sister Anna established dynastic connections that would prove crucial following Louis's death. These arrangements reflected sophisticated understanding of European diplomatic relationships while demonstrating Hungarian recognition of their inability to resist Ottoman expansion without external assistance. The final Ottoman campaign that culminated in the Battle of Mohacs represented Sullian's systematic effort to eliminate Hungarian independence while establishing Ottoman control over Central European territories that had previously remained outside Islamic influence. The Ottoman army that assembled for this campaign included approximately 100,000 troops supported by advanced artillery and logistical systems that enabled sustained operations throughout Hungarian territories. The forces' composition included elite Janissary units, provincial cavalry formations, and specialized siege troops capable of reducing any fortification that might resist their advance. The Hungarian response to Ottoman invasion revealed both the kingdom's military limitations and the courage of nobles who chose to resist despite overwhelming odds against their success. Louis assembled approximately 25,000 troops for the decisive battle, including contingents from throughout the kingdom and small numbers of foreign volunteers who had answered calls for Christian solidarity against Islamic expansion. The Hungarian army's composition reflected traditional medieval military organization, with heavy cavalry forming the core of their battle line supported by infantry units that lacked the training and equipment necessary for effective resistance against Ottoman forces. The Battle of Mohacs on August 29, 1526 represented one of the most decisive military encounters in Central European history as Ottoman forces systematically destroyed Hungarian military capabilities while eliminating the kingdom's political leadership. The battle began with Hungarian cavalry charges against Ottoman positions that initially achieved limited success, before encountering disciplined Janissary formations supported by artillery that proved devastatingly effective against armored knights. The Hungarian forces, fighting with desperate courage, sustained enormous casualties while failing to achieve any significant tactical objectives that might have altered the battle's outcome. Louis II's death during the final stages of combat eliminated the last Jagiellonian ruler while creating succession circumstances that would bring Habsburg authority to both Bohemia and Hungary. The young king's body discovered in a marsh where he had apparently drowned while attempting to escape the battlefield bore wounds that indicated he'd fought personally in the cavalry melees that characterized the battle's final phase. His death symbolized both the end of Hungarian independence and the collapse of the political arrangements that had governed Central Europe since the late 15th century. The immediate aftermath of Mohacs witnessed the rapid disintegration of Hungarian political structures as surviving nobles fled to secure territories while Ottoman forces systematically occupied strategic positions throughout the kingdom. The Hungarian Diet, reduced to a handful of survivors, faced the impossible choice between acknowledging Ottoman suzerainty or seeking Habsburg protection that would end Hungarian independence under different circumstances. The political vacuum created by military defeat enabled competing claimants to assert authority over different regions, while Ottoman forces consolidated their control over territories that had resisted Islamic expansion for centuries. The Bohemian Diet's decision to elect Ferdinand of Austria as their king represented both recognition of Habsburg military capabilities and acceptance of The political realities created by Ottoman expansion in Central Europe. Ferdinand's candidacy offered the prospect of imperial military support against potential Ottoman expansion into Bohemian territories, while his marriage to Louis II's sister provided dynastic legitimacy for Habsburg claims. The electoral agreement established constitutional limitations on royal authority similar to those that had characterized Jagiellonian rule, ensuring continued noble dominance over Bohemian political structures while providing Habsburg rulers with access to the kingdom's resources and strategic position within Central Europe. Ferdinand's coronation as King of Bohemia in Prague Castle on February 24, 1527 marked the beginning of Habsburg rule that would fundamentally transform the kingdom's political, religious, and cultural landscape over the subsequent century. The ceremony itself reflected the delicate balance between Habsburg dynastic ambitions and Bohemian constitutional traditions as Ferdinand accepted the crown and conditions negotiated with the Diet that preserved noble privileges while acknowledging his authority as a hereditary monarch. The coronation regalia, including the crown of St. Vincent's laws with its distinctive fleur-de-lis design and precious stone inlays, symbolize continuity with Bohemian royal traditions. Even as political power shifted decisively toward Vienna and the broader Habsburg imperial system, the constitutional arrangements that accompanied Ferdinand's accession established a framework for Habsburg-Bohemian relations that would persist throughout the 16th century while creating inherent tensions between royal prerogatives and noble autonomy. The Bohemian Diet retained control over taxation and military levies, requiring royal negotiation for revenue collection while maintaining the right to approve or reject proposed legislation. These limitations on royal authority reflected the nobles' determination to preserve the political gains achieved during the Jagiellonian period while recognizing their need for Habsburg military protection against potential Ottoman expansion. Archaeological evidence from noble estates throughout Bohemia reveals extensive fortification improvements undertaken during this period, suggesting continued concerns about territorial security despite Habsburg guarantees of protection. Ferdinand's early administrative reforms demonstrated his understanding of the need to balance imperial integration with respect for Bohemian institutional traditions. He retained existing governmental structures while introducing Habsburg administrative practices that enhanced bureaucratic efficiency and improved coordination between Bohemian and Austrian territories. The establishment of new record-keeping systems enabled more systematic tax collection and military organization, while preserving the legal frameworks that governed noble privileges and municipal autonomy. These changes created hybrid governmental structures that combined Habsburg centralization with Bohemian particularism in ways that satisfied immediate political needs while establishing precedents for future conflicts over constitutional authority. The religious settlement that Ferdinand negotiated during his early reign required careful attention to the complex denominational divisions that had characterized Bohemian Christianity since the Hussite Wars. The kingdom's population included substantial Catholic minorities concentrated in urban areas and along the Austrian border, Hussite communities that maintain their traditional practices under the Compactator agreements, and growing numbers of Lutheran converts attracted by German Protestant teachings. Ferdinand's own Catholic faith created immediate tensions with Protestant nobles who feared systematic persecution, while his imperial obligations required policies that would satisfy papal expectations regarding Counter-Reformation objectives. The resulting religious policies attempted to maintain existing denominational arrangements while gradually strengthening Catholic institutional authority through careful appointment of ecclesiastical officials and educational reforms. The economic integration of Bohemian territories into the broader Habsburg imperial system created new opportunities for commercial development while generating tensions regarding taxation and resource allocation. Ferdinand's policies encouraged trade relationships between Bohemian merchants and partners throughout the Habsburg domains, including access to Mediterranean markets through Trieste and expanded commercial connections with Spanish territories in Italy and the Low Countries. However, these benefits came at the cost of increased taxation to support imperial military operations and administrative expenses that often served Austrian rather than specifically Bohemian interests. The development of new silver mining operations in the Bohemian mountains provided substantial revenues for imperial coffers while employing advanced extraction techniques borrowed from Spanish colonial mining experiences in the Americas. The Ottoman siege of Vienna in 1529 demonstrated both the strategic importance of Bohemian territories within the Habsburg defensive system and the kingdom's vulnerability to Islamic expansion that had already eliminated Hungarian independence. Ferdinand's mobilization of Bohemian military resources for Vienna's defense required extensive negotiations with the Diet regarding troop levies and financial contributions, revealing the constitutional limitations that constrained royal authority even during existential crisis. Bohemian forces that participated in Vienna's defense included approximately 8,000 infantry and 2,000 cavalry, equipped with firearms and artillery that reflected the military modernization that had occurred under Habsburg rule. The siege's ultimate failure resulted from multiple factors, including Ottoman logistical difficulties, Habsburg defensive preparations, and the early onset of winter weather that forced Sulman's withdrawal before the city's fortifications could be breached. The military reforms that Ferdinand implemented following the Ottoman threat revealed his determination to modernize Bohemian defensive capabilities while integrating kingdom forces into the broader imperial military system. Fortification designs incorporated the latest developments in artillery-resistant architecture with star-shaped bastions and geometric defensive systems that could withstand bombardment from contemporary siege guns. The construction of these fortifications required substantial financial investment and technical expertise, leading to the recruitment of Italian military engineers who had developed their skills during the Italian Wars. Archaeological investigations at sites including Terracin and other border fortifications reveal the sophisticated engineering that characterized these defensive improvements, including underground galleries, specialized artillery positions, and advanced water management systems that enabled extended siege resistance. The expansion of firearms production within Bohemian territories reflected both military necessity and economic opportunity as demand for advanced weapons increased throughout Central Europe. Bohemian armaments workshops developed expertise in manufacturing muskets, pistols, and artillery pieces that combined German methodological techniques with innovations developed through practical military experience. The kingdom's iron ore deposits provided raw materials for weapons production, while skilled craftsmen trained in German and Italian workshops established manufacturing centers in Prague and other major towns. These developments created new sources of revenue for royal coffers while providing employment for urban populations that had suffered during previous periods of political instability. Ferdinand's death in 1564 brought his son Maximilian II to the Bohemian throne during a period of relative stability that enabled the new king to pursue more ambitious policies regarding religious accommodation and cultural development. Maximilian's education had exposed him to humanist scholarship and Renaissance artistic traditions that influenced his approach to governance. While his personal religious convictions, which some contemporaries suspected included Protestant sympathies, enabled him to navigate denominational conflicts with greater flexibility than his strictly Catholic father had demonstrated. The new king's court in Prague attracted scholars, artists, and musicians from throughout Europe, while his patronage of architectural projects enhanced the city's reputation as a major cultural center. The religious policies that Maximilian developed during the 1560s and 1570s represented a sophisticated attempt to balance Counter-Reformation objectives with practical recognition of Protestant strength within Bohemian territories. Rather than pursuing systematic persecution of Protestant communities, Maximilian adopted policies of selective tolerance that maintained Catholic institutional authority while permitting Protestant worship under regulated conditions. These arrangements satisfied moderate Protestant nobles who sought religious security rather than political confrontation, while enabling Catholic authorities to claim progress toward denominational unity without provoking the armed resistance that more aggressive policies might have generated. Archaeological evidence from rural parishes throughout Bohemia reveals the construction of new churches during this period that incorporated architectural features suitable for both Catholic and Protestant liturgical practices, suggesting practical accommodation at local levels despite ongoing theological disagreements. The Bohemian Confession of 1575 represented the culmination of Protestant efforts to secure formal recognition of their religious rights while demonstrating the sophisticated theological scholarship that had developed within Reformed communities since the early 16th century. The Confession's authors, led by prominent nobles including Václav Budovich of Budov and other educated Protestant leaders, created a comprehensive statement of faith that combined Lutheran doctrinal positions with elements derived from Hussite traditions and Calvinist theological innovations. The document's careful theological argumentation reflected its author's understanding of the need to present Protestant positions in ways that would satisfy imperial scrutiny, while maintaining the distinctive characteristics that differentiated Bohemian Protestantism from German Lutheran orthodoxy. Maximilian's acceptance of the Bohemian Confession marked a significant departure from previous Habsburg religious policies while establishing precedents for denominational coexistence that would influence Central European development for decades. The king's formal recognition of Protestant rights included guarantees of religious worship, educational autonomy, and legal protection that provided security for Reformed communities while establishing clear boundaries for their activities. These arrangements created a complex religious settlement that satisfied immediate political needs while generating ongoing tensions between Catholic restoration efforts and Protestant institutional development. The implementation of these agreements required careful attention to local circumstances throughout Bohemian territories with different regions, developing varying approaches to denominational coexistence based on their specific demographic and political conditions. The cultural flowering that characterized Maximilian's reign reflected both the resources made available through economic development and the international connections that Habsburg rule had established with artistic centers throughout Europe. Prague Castle underwent extensive renovation projects that incorporated Renaissance architectural elements while preserving Gothic structural features that connected the complex with Bohemian historical traditions. The castle's new residential quarters included elaborate decorative programs that combined Italian artistic techniques with local craftsmanship traditions, creating distinctive architectural styles that influenced building projects throughout Central Europe. The expansion of the castle's gardens employed advanced horticultural techniques borrowed from Italian Renaissance villa designs while incorporating plant species from throughout the Habsburg domains that demonstrated the dynasty's global reach. The establishment of new educational institutions during this period reflected Maximilian's commitment to intellectual development while serving practical needs for trained administrators and clergy capable of managing the kingdom's complex religious and political arrangements. The expansion of Prague universities curriculum included new faculties that offered instruction in mathematics, natural philosophy, and modern languages that prepared students for careers in governmental service or commercial activities. The university's library received substantial additions through royal patronage and private donations, acquiring manuscripts and printed books that enhanced its reputation as a major center of scholarly research. Archaeological investigations of university buildings from this period reveal extensive construction projects that provided adequate facilities for expanded educational activities while incorporating architectural innovations that reflected contemporary academic developments. The succession of Rudolf II in 1576 initiated the most remarkable period of cultural and intellectual achievement in Bohemian history, while establishing Prague as one of Europe's most important centers of Renaissance learning and artistic patronage. Rudolf's decision to transfer the imperial capital from Vienna to Prague reflected both his personal preferences for the city's cultural atmosphere and strategic calculations regarding the advantages of governing the empire from a more central location. The transfer required massive expansion of governmental facilities and residential accommodations that transformed Prague's urban landscape, while attracting thousands of courtiers, administrators, artists, and scholars who contributed to the city's cosmopolitan character. Rudolf's court became renowned throughout Europe for its patronage of scientific research, artistic innovation, and intellectual inquiry that attracted leading figures from diverse fields of learning. The emperor's personal interests in astronomy, alchemy, and natural philosophy created an environment where experimental investigation flourished, alongside traditional scholarly pursuits. Tycho Brahe's arrival in Prague in 1599 established the city as a major center of astronomical research with his observations from the Imperial Observatory contributing fundamental data that would later support Johannes Kepler's revolutionary theories of planetary motion. The observatory's sophisticated instruments, including large brass quadrants and celestial globes, represented the most advanced scientific equipment available in contemporary Europe, while their precise construction demonstrated the high level of craftsmanship that imperial patronage had fostered. The imperial collections that Rudolf assembled during his reign created one of Europe's most remarkable concentrations of artistic and scientific objects while demonstrating the global reach of Habsburg commercial and diplomatic networks. The Cuncuma housed paintings by leading contemporary artists including Jeppe Akimbaldo, whose composite portraits combined naturalistic detail with symbolic complexity that appealed to Rudolf's intellectual interests. The collection also included scientific instruments, mechanical automata, exotic natural specimens, and archaeological artifacts that reflected the emperor's wide-ranging curiosity about the natural world and human creativity. Archaeological excavations in Prague Castle have uncovered remains of workshops where court artisans created decorative objects and scientific instruments, revealing the sophisticated manufacturing capabilities that imperial patronage had developed. The alchemical laboratories that Rudolf established within Prague Castle attracted practitioners from throughout Europe who sought imperial patronage for their experimental investigations into the transformation of matter, and the discovery of universal principles governing natural phenomena. These facilities included furnaces, distillation apparatus, and extensive libraries of alchemical texts that enabled systematic research into chemical processes while maintaining the secrecy that practitioners considered essential for their work. The laboratory's activities combined practical metallurgy and pharmaceutical preparation with theoretical investigations that contributed to the gradual development of modern chemistry. Despite their foundation in medieval alchemical traditions, the religious tensions that developed during Rudolph's later reign reflected both his personal withdrawal from active governance and the growing polarization between Catholic and Protestant factions throughout the Habsburg domains. The emperor's increasing reclusiveness and apparent mental instability created opportunities for competing religious and political factions to assert greater influence over imperial policy. Reducing the careful balance that had characterized previous decades, Catholic authorities, encouraged by Counter-Reformation successes in other European territories, began pressing for more aggressive policies against Protestant communities, while Protestant nobles sought to strengthen their legal protections against potential persecution. These tensions generated ongoing conflicts regarding ecclesiastical appointments, educational policies, and legal jurisdictions that would ultimately contribute to the crisis that erupted following Rudolph's death. The Letter of Majesty that Rudolph issued in 6009 represented his final attempt to resolve religious conflicts through comprehensive guarantees of Protestant rights while maintaining imperial authority over Bohemian territories. The document confirmed Protestant nobles' rights to build churches, appoint clergy, and educate their children according to Reformed theological principles while establishing procedures for resolving denominational disputes that might arise in mixed communities. These provisions satisfied immediate Protestant demands while creating institutional frameworks that theoretically could accommodate continued denominational diversity within a unified political system. However, the letter's implementation required continued imperial support that became uncertain as Rudolph's mental condition deteriorated and succession disputes intensified. The Dienaworth incident of 607 demonstrated the broader imperial tensions that would ultimately undermine the religious settlements that Rudolph had attempted to establish within Bohemian territories. The suppression of Protestant rights in this Bavarian city by Catholic authorities supported by imperial forces revealed the fragility of denominational compromises when confronted with determined opposition from Counter-Reformation advocates. Protestant princes throughout the empire interpreted the incident as evidence of systematic Catholic efforts to eliminate Reformed communities despite existing legal guarantees, leading to the formation of defensive alliances that would contribute to the polarization that characterized early 17th century German politics. The formation of the Protestant Union in 6008 and the Catholic League in 6009 created competing alliance systems that transformed local religious disputes into potential catalysts for empire-wide conflicts while placing Bohemian Protestants in increasingly precarious positions. The Protestant Union's membership included several important German princes who possessed sufficient military resources to resist Catholic expansion, while the Catholic League's formation under Bavarian leadership provided institutional framework for coordinated Counter-Reformation policies. These developments created external pressures that influenced Bohemian denominational conflicts while providing both Protestant and Catholic factions with potential sources of military support for future confrontations. Rudolph's death in January 1612 brought his brother Matthias to the imperial throne during a period of unprecedented religious and political tension throughout the Habsburg domains. Matthias had already assumed control over Hungarian and Austrian territories through agreements negotiated during Rudolf's final years, creating circumstances where his succession to Bohemian royal authority represented consolidation of Habsburg power rather than new dynastic arrangements. However, the new emperor's advanced age and lack of direct heirs created immediate concerns about future succession that would influence political calculations throughout his brief reign. The Bohemian Diet's acceptance of Matthias reflected both constitutional precedent regarding Habsburg hereditary rights and practical recognition of the military realities that made resistance to imperial authority extremely dangerous. The religious policies that Matthias implemented during his reign reflected both his personal Catholic convictions and practical recognition of the need to maintain stability within territories that contained substantial Protestant populations. His confirmation of the Letter of Majesty satisfied immediate Protestant demands, while his appointment of Catholic officials to key administrative positions demonstrated his commitment to gradual Counter-Reformation objectives. These policies created ongoing tensions between official religious tolerance and practical discrimination that would contribute to the crisis that erupted following his death. Archaeological evidence from Protestant churches throughout Bohemia reveals modifications made during this period that suggest concerns about potential Catholic interference with Reformed worship practices, including the construction of concealed meeting spaces and the removal of decorative elements that might attract unwanted attention. The succession arrangements that Matthias negotiated during his final years established his cousin Ferdinand of Styria as heir to Habsburg territories while creating circumstances that would test the constitutional frameworks that had governed Bohemian politics since the early 16th century. Ferdinand's reputation as a committed Counter-Reformation advocate generated immediate concerns among Protestant nobles who feared systematic persecution of Reformed communities under his rule. The Bohemian Diet's reluctant acceptance of Ferdinand's succession reflected both constitutional precedent and recognition of their limited ability to resist Habsburg dynastic claims without external military support that was unlikely to materialize. Given the complex international circumstances that characterized early 17th century European politics, the growing tensions that characterized the final years of Matthias's reign reflected both specific concerns about Ferdinand's succession and broader anxieties regarding the future of Protestant communities throughout Central Europe. The Catholic victories in the Dulic-Cleve succession dispute and other contemporary conflicts demonstrated the effectiveness of Counter-Reformation military strategies while revealing Protestant weaknesses in coordinating defensive efforts against systematic Catholic expansion. These developments created psychological pressures within Bohemian Protestant communities that contributed to the radicalization that would ultimately lead to open rebellion against Habsburg authority. The construction of new fortifications at Protestant noble estates throughout Bohemia during this period suggests preparation for potential military resistance despite the enormous risks associated with confronting imperial power. Matthias's death on March 20, 1619, created the succession crisis that would transform local Bohemian religious and constitutional disputes into the catalyst for the most devastating conflict in European history. Ferdinand II's accession to imperial authority coincided with his assumption of Bohemian royal titles, creating circumstances where opposition to his rule would constitute rebellion against both kingdom and empire. The new emperor's immediate implementation of Counter-Reformation policies, including the appointment of Catholic officials to positions previously held by Protestants and restrictions on Reformed educational activities, confirmed Protestant fears regarding his intentions. while providing justification for the resistance that had been developing. Throughout the previous decade, the Second Defenestration of Prague on May 23, 1618 represented the culmination of mounting tensions between Protestant nobles and imperial authorities while establishing violent precedents that would characterize the subsequent conflict. The incident began as a confrontation between Protestant representatives and imperial governors regarding the implementation of religious policies that Protestants considered violations of the Letter of Majesty's guarantees. When negotiations failed to resolve these disputes, Protestant leaders, including Count Thursday, physically expelled the imperial governors Martinitz and Slavata from windows of Prague castles council chamber, recreating the dramatic gesture that had initiated the Hussite revolution 2 centuries earlier. The governors' survival after their fall into the castle moat's refuge heap was attributed by Catholics to miraculous intervention, while Protestants claimed their thick coats had cushioned their landing, creating competing narratives that reflected the deeper ideological divisions that separated the opposing factions. The immediate aftermath of the defenestration witnessed the rapid collapse of imperial authority throughout Bohemian territories as Protestant nobles assumed control of governmental institutions while beginning military preparations for the conflict they recognized was now inevitable. The formation of a provisional government under Protestant leadership eliminated Habsburg administrative authority while establishing new constitutional arrangements that theoretically restored the elective monarchy that had characterized pre-Habsburg Bohemian politics. These changes required extensive reorganization of governmental structures and military forces while creating diplomatic opportunities for alliances with other European powers that opposed Habsburg hegemony. The speed and effectiveness of these organizational efforts demonstrated the sophisticated planning that had preceded the defenestration while revealing the extent of Protestant preparation for armed resistance against imperial authority. The Protestant rebellion that had erupted following the Second Defenestration of Prague created unprecedented opportunities for Ferdinand to reshape Bohemian political and religious structures according to Counter-Reformation principles while eliminating the constitutional limitations that had constrained Habsburg authority for nearly a century. The emperor's systematic response to the crisis combined diplomatic isolation of Protestant forces with military preparations that would enable decisive intervention once international circumstances permitted effective action. Ferdinand's negotiations with Catholic allies throughout Europe, including Pope Paul V, Philip III of Spain, and Maximilian of Bavaria, created financial and military resources that far exceeded anything the Bohemian Protestant rebels could mobilize through their limited alliance networks with German Protestant princes and potential Ottoman support. The military preparations that Ferdinand undertook during 1619 and early 1620 demonstrated the sophisticated logistical capabilities that the Habsburg imperial system had developed. Through decades of warfare against Ottoman forces and rebellious subjects throughout the dynasty's diverse territories, imperial recruiting agents operated throughout Catholic regions of the Holy Roman Empire, offering attractive terms of service that drew experienced soldiers from previous campaigns in Hungary, Italy, and the Low Countries. These professional forces included Spanish tercios veterans whose disciplined infantry formations had proven devastatingly effective in contemporary European warfare, while German Catholic cavalry units provided mobile strike capabilities that could exploit tactical opportunities created by coordinated infantry and artillery operations. The Catholic League's military contributions to Ferdinand's campaign reflected both religious solidarity against Protestant rebellion and strategic calculations regarding the Advantages of eliminating Bohemian Protestant influence within the imperial system. Maximilian of Bavaria's forces included approximately 25,000 well-trained troops, equipped with modern firearms and artillery pieces manufactured in Augsburg, workshops that had developed advanced metallurgical techniques through decades of weapons production for imperial armies. The Bavarian army's organizational structure incorporated lessons learned from previous conflicts, including standardized supply procedures, medical services, and communication systems that enabled effective coordination during extended campaign operations in foreign territories. The Protestant military response to imperial preparations revealed both the determination of Bohemian rebels and the fundamental weaknesses that would ultimately determine their defeat. The Bohemian estates' attempts to create effective military forces faced enormous challenges, including limited financial resources, inadequate weapons production capabilities, and the absence of experienced military leadership capable of coordinating resistance against professional imperial armies. The rebels' early military efforts focused on securing control of strategic fortifications throughout Bohemian territories while attempting to establish alliance relationships with Protestant powers that could provide the external support necessary for sustained resistance against Habsburg military superiority. Christian of Anhalt's appointment as commander of Protestant forces represented the rebels' attempt to acquire professional military leadership, while his previous experience in Dutch service against Spanish forces provided valuable knowledge of contemporary military techniques and organizational methods. However, Christian's forces remained fundamentally inferior to imperial armies in terms of equipment, training, and logistical support. But his strategic position required defensive operations that negated many advantages the Protestant forces might have possessed through superior knowledge of local terrain and population support. The Protestant army that assembled during the summer of 1620 included approximately 21,000 troops drawn from Bohemian levies, German Protestant auxiliaries, and Hungarian allies whose military effectiveness varied considerably based on their previous combat experience and equipment quality. The campaign that culminated in the Battle of White Mountain began with imperial forces crossing into Bohemian territory in September 1620, employing systematic advance procedures that secured their supply lines while preventing Protestant forces from conducting effective harassment operations against their columns. The imperial army's movement toward Prague demonstrated sophisticated understanding of the strategic requirements for successful siege operations against a major fortified city, including the establishment of secure bases for artillery positions and the coordination of multiple approach routes that would enable encirclement of defensive positions. Archaeological evidence from the campaign route reveals extensive evidence of imperial military organization, including standardized camp layouts, defensive earthworks, and supply depot locations that reflect advanced logistical planning. The Protestant decision to meet imperial forces in open battle rather than conducting siege defense of Prague reflected both strategic calculations regarding their inability to withstand extended siege operations and political pressures from nobles who demanded active resistance rather than passive defense. The Protestant army's deployment on White Mountain, a low ridge west of Prague, provided defensive advantages, including elevated positions for artillery placement and clear fields of fire against advancing enemy formations. However, the position also created tactical limitations by preventing effective retreat if the battle developed unfavorably while exposing Protestant forces to potential flanking maneuvers that could exploit the relatively open terrain surrounding their defensive positions. The Battle of White Mountain on November 8, 1620 began with artillery exchanges that demonstrated the superior quality and quantity of imperial cannon compared to Protestant ordnance with Catholic gunners achieving more accurate fire that disrupted enemy formations while maintaining better protection for their own equipment and personnel. The imperial artillery bombardment included both direct fire against Protestant infantry positions and indirect fire that targeted command posts and supply areas behind enemy lines. Archaeological investigations at the battlefield have revealed numerous cannonballs and artillery fragments that indicate the intensity of the bombardment, with iron projectiles ranging from small anti-personnel rounds to large siege gun ammunition designed to breach fortified positions. The infantry assault that followed the artillery preparation showcased the tactical superiority of imperial forces, while revealing the fundamental weaknesses in Protestant military organization that had developed during their brief period of independence. The Catholic advance employed coordinated formations that combined pike squares with musketeer units in ways that maximized firepower while maintaining defensive capabilities against cavalry charges. The Spanish Tercia's veterans who formed the corps of imperial infantry demonstrated the discipline and tactical flexibility that had made them Europe's most feared soldiers, advancing steadily despite Protestant resistance while maintaining formation integrity that enabled effective mutual support between different units. The Protestant resistance during the battle's initial phases demonstrated considerable individual courage while revealing the organizational problems that prevented effective coordination between different elements of their army. Protestant infantry units fought tenaciously from their defensive positions, inflicting significant casualties on advancing imperial forces through effective use of firearms and artillery. However, the lack of experienced officers capable of coordinating tactical responses to changing battlefield conditions prevented Protestant forces from exploiting opportunities that might have altered the battle's outcome. The absence of adequate reserves that could reinforce threatened positions or exploit tactical successes created circumstances where initial defensive advantages were gradually eroded through sustained imperial pressure. The Protestant military response to imperial preparations revealed both the determination of Bohemian rebels and the fundamental weaknesses that would ultimately determine their defeat. The Bohemian estates' attempts to create effective military forces faced enormous challenges, including limited financial resources, inadequate weapons production capabilities, and the absence of experienced military leadership capable of coordinating resistance against professional imperial armies. The rebels' early military efforts focused on securing control of strategic fortifications throughout Bohemian territories while attempting to establish alliance relationships with Protestant powers that could provide the external support necessary for sustained resistance against Habsburg military superiority. Christian of Anhalt's appointment as commander of Protestant forces represented the rebels' attempt to acquire professional military leadership, while his previous experience in Dutch service against Spanish forces provided valuable knowledge of contemporary military techniques and organizational methods. However, Christian's forces remained fundamentally inferior to imperial armies in terms of equipment, training, and logistical support. While his strategic position required defensive operations that negated many advantages the Protestant forces might have possessed through superior knowledge of local terrain and population support. The Protestant army that assembled during the summer of 1620 included approximately 21,000 troops drawn from Bohemian levies, German Protestant auxiliaries, and Hungarian allies whose military effectiveness varied considerably based on their previous combat experience and equipment quality. The campaign that culminated in the Battle of White Mountain began with Imperial forces crossing into Bohemian territory in September 1620, employing systematic advance procedures that secured their supply lines while preventing Protestant forces from conducting effective harassment operations against their columns. The Imperial Army's movement toward Prague demonstrated sophisticated understanding of the strategic requirements for successful siege operations against a major fortified city, including the establishment of secure bases for artillery positions and the coordination of multiple approach routes that would enable encirclement of defensive positions. Archaeological evidence from the campaign route reveals extensive evidence of imperial military organization, including standardized camp layouts, defensive earthworks, and supply depot locations that reflect advanced logistical planning. The Protestant decision to meet imperial forces in open battle rather than conducting siege defense of Prague reflected both strategic calculations regarding their inability to withstand extended siege operations and political pressures from nobles who demanded active resistance rather than passive defense. The Protestant army's deployment on White Mountain, a low ridge west of Prague, provided defensive advantages, including elevated positions for artillery placement and clear fields of fire against advancing enemy formations. However, the position also created tactical limitations by preventing effective retreat if the battle developed unfavorably while exposing Protestant forces to potential flanking maneuvers that could exploit the relatively open terrain surrounding their defensive positions. The Battle of White Mountain on November 8, 1620 began with artillery exchanges that demonstrated the superior quality and quantity of imperial cannon compared to Protestant ordnance, with Catholic gunners achieving more accurate fire that disrupted enemy formations while maintaining better protection for their own equipment and personnel. The imperial artillery bombardment included both direct fire against Protestant infantry positions and indirect fire that targeted command posts and supply areas behind enemy lines. Archaeological investigations at the battlefield have revealed numerous cannonballs and artillery fragments that indicate the intensity of the bombardment, with iron projectiles ranging from small anti-personnel rounds to large siege gun ammunition designed to breach fortified positions. The infantry assault that followed the artillery preparation showcased the tactical superiority of imperial forces, while revealing the fundamental weaknesses in Protestant military organization that had developed during their brief period of independence. The Catholic advance employed coordinated formations that combined pike squares with musketeer units in ways that maximized firepower while maintaining defensive capabilities against cavalry charges. The Spanish Tercia's veterans who formed the corps of imperial infantry demonstrated the discipline and tactical flexibility that had made them Europe's most feared soldiers, advancing steadily despite Protestant resistance while maintaining formation integrity that enabled effective mutual support between different units. The Protestant resistance during the battle's initial phases demonstrated considerable individual courage while revealing the organizational problems that prevented effective coordination between different elements of their army. Protestant infantry units fought tenaciously from their defensive positions, inflicting significant casualties on advancing imperial forces through effective use of firearms and artillery. However, the lack of experienced officers capable of coordinating tactical responses to changing battlefield conditions prevented Protestant forces from exploiting opportunities that might have altered the battle's outcome. The absence of adequate reserves that could reinforce threatened positions or exploit tactical successes created circumstances where initial defensive advantages were gradually eroded through sustained imperial pressure. Imperial commissioners conducted detailed inventories of rebel properties that included not only landed estates, but also urban properties, commercial enterprises, and personal possessions that could be liquidated to fund governmental operations. These confiscations affected approximately 680 noble families and thousands of urban property owners, creating economic disruption that would influence Bohemian social development for generations while eliminating the material foundations of Protestant political influence. The redistribution of confiscated properties to Catholic nobles and imperial supporters created new social hierarchies that would characterize Bohemian society throughout the early modern period while ensuring loyalty to Habsburg authority through material incentives that tied elite interests to dynastic survival. The recipients of redistributed properties included Spanish and Italian nobles who had supported Ferdinand. During the rebellion, German Catholic families who could provide administrative expertise, and Bohemian Catholics who had remained loyal during the crisis. Archaeological evidence from noble estates throughout Bohemia reveals extensive construction projects undertaken by new owners who sought to demonstrate their elevated social status while adapting properties to contemporary architectural standards that reflected their cultural backgrounds and aesthetic preferences. The Jesuit educational initiatives that accompanied a political transformation represented Ferdinand's systematic effort to create new intellectual foundations for Catholic authority while eliminating the Protestant scholarly traditions that had flourished at Prague University and other educational institutions throughout Bohemian territories. The Society of Jesus received extensive privileges and financial support that enabled them to establish schools throughout the kingdom while assuming control of university education that would shape future generations of Bohemian intellectual and political leadership. The Jesuit curriculum emphasized classical languages, Catholic theology, and scholastic philosophy while eliminating the humanist educational approaches that had characterized Protestant academic institutions. The Clementinum complex in Prague became the center of Jesuit educational activities, while its extensive library and astronomical observatory demonstrated the intellectual sophistication that Catholic educational institutions could achieve through adequate financial support and international scholarly networks. The Jesuit professors who staffed these institutions included scholars trained at leading Catholic universities throughout Europe, bringing advanced knowledge of contemporary intellectual developments while maintaining strict adherence to Counter-Reformation theological principles. Archaeological investigations of Jesuit buildings throughout Bohemia reveal the extensive construction projects that accompanied their educational expansion, including specialized facilities for scientific instruction, library storage, and residential accommodation for international faculty and students. The linguistic policies implemented during the early decades of Habsburg absolutism reflected systematic efforts to reduce Czech cultural autonomy while promoting German administrative and cultural dominance throughout Bohemian territories. Imperial decrees established German as the primary language for governmental operations, legal proceedings, and commercial transactions while restricting Czech usage to informal communications and religious services for rural populations. These policies created practical advantages for German-speaking administrators and merchants while systematically disadvantaging Czech speakers who sought advancement in governmental, commercial, or ecclesiastical careers. The Implementation of the robot system represented Ferdinand's response to the labor shortages created by population. Losses during the rebellion and subsequent immigration of Protestant families to territories that offered religious tolerance. The new system required peasants to provide specified amounts of unpaid labor to noble landlords while restricting their freedom of movement and economic activities in ways that approached serfdom in many regions. The arrangements provided nobles with the agricultural labor necessary for estate operations while ensuring social stability through legal restrictions that prevented peasant mobility and political organization. Archaeological evidence from rural settlements reveals the construction of new manor houses and agricultural buildings that reflected increased noble control over rural populations while demonstrating the architectural preferences of new Catholic landowners. The Catholic architectural transformation that characterized the mid-17th century created distinctive Baroque landscapes throughout Bohemian territories while demonstrating the cultural ambitions of new religious and political authorities. The reconstruction of Prague Castle incorporated Italian Baroque design elements while preserving Gothic structural features that connected the complex with Bohemian historical traditions. The castle's new ceremonial spaces included elaborate decorative programs that emphasized Habsburg dynastic legitimacy, while religious imagery reinforced Catholic theological principles that had replaced Protestant alternatives. The scale and sophistication of these architectural projects required substantial financial investment while employing craftsmen from throughout Catholic Europe who introduced new artistic techniques and decorative traditions. The parish church construction that accompanied Catholic restoration created new religious landscapes throughout rural Bohemia while providing architectural settings appropriate for Counter-Reformation liturgical practices. These buildings incorporated Baroque design elements, including dramatic lighting effects, elaborate altar installations, and sophisticated sculptural programs that emphasize Catholic theological principles while creating emotionally powerful worship experiences. The church's decorative programs often included imagery that specifically refuted Protestant theological positions, while celebrating Catholic saints and religious practices that have been eliminated during the Protestant period. Archaeological investigations of rural churches reveal the extensive modifications made to existing buildings, while new construction employed standardized design elements that reflected centralized planning by ecclesiastical authorities. The gradual economic recovery that characterized the later 17th century reflected both the restoration of political stability and the integration of Bohemian territories into broader Habsburg commercial networks that provided access to markets throughout Central and Southern Europe. The development of new manufacturing industries, including textile production and metalwork, created urban employment opportunities while generating revenues that supported continued architectural and cultural projects. The expansion of agricultural production on redistributed noble estates employed improved farming techniques, while the growth of market towns provided commercial centers that facilitated exchange between rural producers and urban consumers. The demographic changes that accompany political and religious transformation included substantial population movements as Protestant families immigrated to territories that offered religious tolerance, while Catholic settlers arrived from other Habsburg domains and German territories. These migrations created new ethnic and religious compositions in many regions, while introducing different cultural traditions and economic practices that would influence Bohemian development for centuries. Parish records from throughout Bohemia document these population changes while revealing the gradual linguistic shift from Czech to German in many areas where new settlers established dominant cultural patterns. The death of Emperor Charles V 6th on October 20, 1740 precipitated the most serious accession crisis in Habsburg history while creating unprecedented opportunities for European powers to challenge Austrian dominance in Central Europe. The pragmatic sanction that Charles had spent decades negotiating with European courts theoretically guaranteed his daughter Maria Theresa's inheritance of all Habsburg territories, including the Bohemian crown. However, the document's legal validity faced immediate challenges from multiple claimants who possessed alternative dynastic justifications for their territorial ambitions. Frederick II of Prussia emerged as the most immediate threat, launching his invasion of Silesia in December 1740. With an army of 27,000 troops that employed advanced military tactics and superior artillery to overwhelm Austrian defensive positions that had not been adequately prepared for sustained warfare. The Prussian occupation of Silesia demonstrated both the effectiveness of Frederick's military reforms and the fundamental weaknesses that had developed within Habsburg defensive capabilities during the peaceful decades following the Turkish Wars. Prussian forces employed disciplined infantry formations equipped with improved flint-lock muskets and supported by mobile artillery units that could rapidly concentrate firepower against specific targets. The Prussian army's organizational structure incorporated lessons learned from contemporary European conflicts, including standardized drill procedures, effective supply systems, and medical services that maintained unit strength during extended campaign operations. Archaeological evidence from Sicilian battlefields reveals the extensive use of iron cannonballs and musket ammunition that demonstrated the industrial capabilities Frederick had developed to support his military ambitions. The Battle of Mulwitz on April 10, 1741 provided Frederick with his first major victory against Austrian forces, while revealing the tactical innovations that would characterize Prussian military success throughout the subsequent conflicts. The Prussian infantry's disciplined volleys proved devastatingly effective against Austrian cavalry charges with coordinated musket fire, creating killing zones that traditional mounted tactics could not overcome. Austrian forces commanded by Field Marshal Knight employed conventional military methods that had proven successful during previous conflicts but proved inadequate against Prussian tactical innovations. The battle's outcome confirmed Prussian control over Lower Silesia while demonstrating to other European powers that Austrian military weakness created opportunities for territorial gains that had been impossible during Charles VI's reign. Maria Theresa's response to the Silesian crisis revealed both her personal determination and the institutional strengths that enabled Habsburg recovery. Despite initial military disasters, the young Archduchess, only 23 years old when she inherited the throne, possessed limited governmental experience, but demonstrated exceptional political instincts that enabled her to navigate the complex diplomatic and military challenges that threatened to dismember her inheritance. Her appeal to the Hungarian Diet for military support, delivered personally in September 1741, while holding her infant son, Joseph, created powerful emotional responses that transcended the constitutional limitations that had previously constrained Hungarian assistance to Austrian causes. The Hungarian nobles' enthusiastic response to Maria Theresa's appeal provided crucial military resources that enabled Habsburg resistance to continue. Despite Prussian occupation of Silesia and French threats to Austrian territories in Italy and the Low Countries, the Hungarian Diet authorized substantial troop levies and financial contributions, while Hungarian noble cavalry units provided mobile forces. that could operate effectively in the diverse terrain conditions that characterized Central European warfare. These Hungarian contingents included approximately 40,000 troops whose military effectiveness reflected both traditional Maguia martial traditions and recent organizational improvements that had been implemented following Ottoman conflicts. The broader European coalition that formed against Maria Theresa during 1741 and 1742 included France, Bavaria, Saxony, and eventually Spain, creating military pressures on multiple fronts that tested Habsburg administrative and financial capabilities to their limits. French forces invaded Austrian territories in the Low Countries while Bavarian troops, supported by French auxiliaries, advanced toward Vienna through Upper Austria. The coordination of these multiple threats required sophisticated diplomatic arrangements among the Allied powers, while their military operations demonstrated the strategic vulnerabilities that had developed within the Habsburg defensive system during decades of relative peace. The election of Charles Albert of Bavaria as Holy Roman Emperor in January 1742 represented the most serious challenge to Habsburg imperial authority since the medieval period, while creating constitutional crisis that threatened to permanently exclude the dynasty from imperial leadership. Charles Albert's coronation as Charles VII provided the anti-Austrian coalition with imperial legitimacy for their territorial claims, while his Bavarian base offered strategic positions that threatened Austrian communications between their German and Italian territories. However, the new emperor's limited financial resources and dependence on French military support created fundamental weaknesses that Habsburg diplomacy would eventually exploit to restore their imperial position. The Bohemian campaign that accompanied the imperial election demonstrated both the continued loyalty of Bohemian territories to Habsburg authority and the effectiveness of defensive strategies that Maria Theresa's advisors had developed to protect their core territories. French and Bavarian forces that invaded Bohemia in 1741 initially achieved significant success, capturing Prague in November and establishing temporary control over much of the kingdom. However, the inability to maintain adequate supply lines during winter operations created vulnerabilities that Austrian forces exploited through systematic harassment of enemy communications and supply depots. The Austrian recovery of Prague in December 1742 marked a crucial turning point in the war while demonstrating the resilience of Habsburg authority when confronted with existential threats. The Austrian assault on French and Bavarian positions employed coordinated infantry and artillery attacks that exploited enemy weaknesses created by extended siege operations and inadequate winter preparations. The recapture of Prague eliminated the most serious threat to Habsburg control over Bohemian territories while providing Maria Theresa with secure bases for continued resistance against the European coalition that had formed against her inheritance. The Treaty of Chapelle in 1748 concluded the War of Austrian Succession with territorial arrangements that confirmed both Habsburg survival and the permanent loss of Silesia to Prussian control. Maria Theresa's acceptance of Clesian loss represented a pragmatic recognition of military realities, while her retention of all other inherited territories demonstrated the effectiveness of Habsburg resistance despite overwhelming initial disadvantages. The treaty's provisions regarding imperial succession restored Habsburg control over the Holy Roman Empire while establishing Francis Stephen of Lorraine, Maria Theresa's husband, as emperor. Francis first through arrangements that preserved Habsburg dynastic interests within modified constitutional frameworks. The administrative reforms that Maria Theresa implemented during the 1750s and 1760s represented systematic efforts to strengthen Habsburg governmental capabilities while addressing the institutional weaknesses that had been revealed during the Succession War. The establishment of new bureaucratic procedures created more efficient tax collection systems, while standardized administrative practices reduced regional variations that had previously limited governmental effectiveness. These reforms included the creation of professional civil service positions that required educational qualifications, rather than noble birth, introducing merit-based advancement that attracted capable administrators from diverse social backgrounds. The military reforms that accompanied administrative modernization reflected lessons learned from Prussian tactical successes while incorporating Austrian strategic requirements that differed from Prussian offensive capabilities. The establishment of new military mize provided professional training for officer candidates while standardized drill procedures improved unit coordination and battlefield effectiveness. These reforms included the adoption of improved firearms and artillery that could match Prussian military technology, while organizational changes enhanced logistical capabilities that had proven inadequate during recent conflicts. The economic policies that Maria Theresa developed during the 1750s demonstrated sophisticated understanding of the relationship between commercial development and military capabilities while addressing the fiscal constraints that had limited Habsburg responses to external threats. The encouragement of manufacturing industries through tax incentives and protective tariffs created domestic production capabilities that reduced dependence on foreign suppliers while generating employment for urban populations. The improvement of transportation infrastructure, including road construction and river navigation projects, facilitated commercial development while enhancing military mobility that proved crucial for territorial defense. The educational reforms that characterized Maria Theresa's reign reflected both Enlightenment influences and practical recognition of the need for educated populations capable of supporting modern governmental and military institutions. The establishment of compulsory primary education created literacy levels that enabled more effective administrative communication while providing foundations for advanced technical training that supported manufacturing development. The expansion of secondary education included new curricula that emphasized practical subjects including mathematics, natural philosophy, and modern languages that prepared students for careers in governmental service or commercial activities. The religious policies that Maria Theresa pursued throughout her reign balanced her personal Catholic devotion with practical recognition of the need to accommodate religious minorities within her diverse territories. The gradual relaxation of restrictions on Protestant worship reflected both Enlightenment influences and strategic calculations regarding the advantages of religious tolerance for commercial development and population retention. These policies created new opportunities for religious minorities while maintaining Catholic institutional dominance that satisfied conservative elements within Habsburg territories. The abolition of serfdom that Maria Theresa initiated during the 1770s represented one of the most significant social reforms in Central European history while addressing economic inefficiencies that had limited agricultural productivity throughout Habsburg territories. The new legal arrangements granted peasants personal freedom and property rights while establishing cash rent payments that replaced traditional labor obligations. These changes created incentives for agricultural improvement, while generating increased tax revenues that supported continued governmental modernization. Archaeological evidence from rural settlements throughout Bohemia reveals extensive construction projects undertaken by newly free peasants who invested their increased earnings in improved housing and agricultural facilities. The succession of Joseph II in 1780 brought to power a ruler whose Enlightenment convictions and reformist ambitions would transform Habsburg territories through systematic implementation of rational governmental principles. Joseph's co-rule with his mother during the previous 15 years had provided him with extensive administrative experience, while his travels throughout European intellectual centers had exposed him to contemporary philosophical developments that influenced his approach to governmental reform. The new emperor's personal commitment to Enlightenment principles created unprecedented opportunities for comprehensive social and political transformation, while his determination to implement reforms rapidly generated resistance from conservative elements who preferred gradual change. The Edict of Tolerance that Joseph issued in 1781 represented the most comprehensive guarantee of religious freedom in contemporary European history while eliminating legal disabilities that had previously restricted Protestant and Orthodox Christian communities throughout Habsburg territories. The edict granted religious minorities the right to build churches, establish schools, and participate fully in commercial and professional activities while maintaining Catholic institutional privileges in areas where they possessed historical precedents. These provisions created new opportunities for religious minorities while demonstrating Joseph's commitment to rational governmental principles that prioritized administrative efficiency over traditional religious distinctions. The administrative reforms that Joseph implemented during the 1780s created uniform governmental structures throughout Habsburg territories while eliminating regional privileges that had previously complicated imperial administration. The establishment of German as the sole administrative language simplified bureaucratic procedures while creating career opportunities for educated individuals regardless of their ethnic backgrounds. These language policies generated resistance from Hungarian and Czech nobles who viewed them as threats to their cultural autonomy, while practical implementation required extensive retraining of governmental personnel who had previously conducted business in local languages. The judicial reforms that accompanied administrative modernization established uniform legal codes throughout Habsburg territories while eliminating torture and other cruel punishments that Enlightenment philosophers had condemned as violations of human dignity. The new legal procedures emphasized evidence-based prosecution while providing defendants with rights that had been absent from traditional judicial systems. These reforms created more predictable legal environments that facilitated commercial development while demonstrating Joseph's commitment to rational governmental principles that treated all subjects equally regardless of their social status. The economic policies that Joseph pursued during the 1780s reflected physiocratic influences that emphasized agricultural development while reducing traditional restrictions on commercial activities. The elimination of internal trade barriers facilitated economic integration throughout Habsburg territories, while new tax systems based on land values rather than social status created more equitable revenue collection. These policies generated increased governmental revenues while creating incentives for agricultural improvement that enhanced food production throughout the monarchy. The resistance to Joseph's reforms that developed during the later 1780s reflected both specific grievances regarding particular policies and broader concerns about the pace and scope of governmental transformation. Hungarian nobles organized systematic opposition to language requirements and administrative changes that threatened their traditional privileges, while Belgian territories erupted in revolt against religious policies that restricted Catholic institutional authority, these resistance movements demonstrated the practical limitations of enlightened reform when implemented without adequate attention to local traditions and interests. The Czech national awakening that began during Joseph's reign represented both response to his linguistic policies and broader cultural developments that had been fostering ethnic consciousness throughout Central Europe. Czech intellectuals including Josef Drovský and Josef Youngman began systematic efforts to preserve and develop Czech literary traditions while creating modern educational materials that could compete with German cultural dominance. These scholarly activities created foundations for Czech cultural revival while demonstrating the unintended consequences of Joseph's administrative uniformity that had sought to eliminate ethnic distinctions. The death of Joseph II in February 1790 brought his brother Leopold II to power during a period of unprecedented crisis as revolutionary upheavals in France created new ideological challenges while internal resistance to Habsburg reforms threatened territorial disintegration. Leopold's brief reign focused on restoring stability through careful modification of Joseph's most controversial policies while maintaining essential administrative improvements that had enhanced governmental effectiveness. The new emperor's diplomatic skills enabled successful negotiation of compromises with Hungarian and Belgian opposition movements, while his death in March 1792 prevented full implementation of his stabilization programs. The succession of Francis II in 1792 coincided with the outbreak of revolutionary wars that would transform European political relationships while creating existential threats to traditional monarchical authority throughout the continent. The young emperor inherited territories that remained destabilized by recent reform efforts while facing military challenges from French revolutionary forces that employed new tactical methods and ideological motivations that differed fundamentally from traditional European warfare. The Habsburg response to these challenges required mobilization of resources on unprecedented scales while diplomatic efforts sought to create effective coalitions against French expansion. The French Revolutionary Wars that dominated European politics during the 1790s created repeated military crises that tested Habsburg defensive capabilities, while demonstrating both the strengths and limitations of the administrative reforms that had been implemented during previous decades. Austrian forces employed traditional military methods that proved initially effective against revolutionary armies, but gradually lost effectiveness as French forces developed new tactical approaches that exploited the revolutionary enthusiasm of their troops. The series of military defeats that Austrian forces suffered during the 1790s revealed fundamental problems in Habsburg military organization while creating political pressures that would influence subsequent governmental policies. The Treaty of Campo Formio in 1797 concluded the first phase of revolutionary warfare with territorial arrangements that confirmed Austrian loss of Belgian territories while compensating Habsburg losses through acquisition of Venetian territories that had been eliminated by French conquest. These territorial exchanges demonstrated both the Habsburg capacity for diplomatic adaptation and the broader European transformation that was eliminating traditional political structures throughout the continent. The treaty's provisions regarding imperial arrangements created precedents for constitutional changes that would ultimately lead to the Holy Roman Empire's dissolution. The resumption of warfare in 1805. Following Napoleon's assumption of imperial authority created new military challenges that would test Habsburg capabilities against the most sophisticated military organization in contemporary European history. The Grand May that Napoleon assembled for his Austrian campaign employed organizational innovations and tactical methods that had been developed through years of continuous warfare, while French industrial capabilities provided equipment advantages that traditional Austrian manufacturing could not match. The campaign that culminated in the Battle of Austerlitz demonstrated both Napoleon's tactical genius and the fundamental obsolescence of traditional European military methods when confronted with revolutionary innovations. The Battle of Elates on December 2, 1805 represented one of the most decisive military encounters in European history, while demonstrating Napoleon's ability to coordinate complex tactical maneuvers that exploited enemy weaknesses with devastating effectiveness. The French victory eliminated the Third Coalition while forcing Austria to accept territorial losses that included substantial Bohemian territories that were transferred to Napoleon's German allies. The battle's outcome confirmed French military supremacy while creating political circumstances that would necessitate fundamental changes in Central European political organization. The Treaty of Pressburg that concluded the 1805 campaign required Austrian acceptance of territorial losses that eliminated traditional Habsburg influence in southwestern German territories while confirming Napoleon's dominant position within the European political system. The treaty's provisions regarding imperial arrangements created constitutional crises that threatened the Holy Roman Empire's continued existence, while French pressure on German princes encouraged their withdrawal from traditional imperial obligations. These developments created circumstances where imperial dissolution became inevitable despite centuries of constitutional tradition that had connected Central European territories through imperial authority. Francis's proclamation of the Austrian Empire in August 1804 represented his attempt to preserve Habsburg imperial dignity, while adapting to changing European circumstances that threatened traditional imperial structures. The new imperial title provided constitutional frameworks that could accommodate the loss of Holy Roman imperial authority while maintaining Habsburg claims to imperial status within their hereditary territories. These arrangements created new relationships between Habsburg rulers and their subjects while eliminating the complex constitutional obligations that had characterized Holy Roman imperial governance. The dissolution of the Holy Roman Empire on August 6, 1806 concluded over 8 centuries of imperial history while marking the definitive end of medieval political structures that had governed Central European development since Charlemagne's coronation. Francis's abdication of the Holy Roman imperial title reflected both French pressure and practical recognition that the empire's constitutional foundations had been irreparably damaged by revolutionary warfare and territorial changes. The formal dissolution eliminated legal frameworks that had connected diverse German territories, while creating opportunities for new political arrangements that would characterize 19th-century European development. The transformation of the Kingdom of Bohemia into a crownland of the Austrian Empire represented both constitutional change and practical continuity. Habsburg administrative structures remained largely unchanged despite new imperial arrangements. Bohemian territories retained their historical boundaries and traditional administrative institutions, while new imperial frameworks provided legal contexts that accommodated the elimination of Holy Roman constitutional obligations. These changes created new relationships between Bohemian institutions and imperial authority while preserving cultural and administrative traditions that had developed over centuries of Habsburg rule. The conclusion of this transformative period marked the end of existence as an independent kingdom within the Holy Roman Empire while establishing new constitutional foundations that would govern its development throughout the modern period. The administrative, social, and cultural changes that had occurred during the 18th century created institutional frameworks that would influence Bohemian development for generations, while the elimination of traditional imperial structures opened possibilities for new forms of political organization that would characterize subsequent European history. The kingdom that had emerged from Slavic tribal origins in the 6th century achieved royal dignity under the Pre-Mislids, survived the religious upheavals of the Hussite period, and adapted to Habsburg rule had been transformed into a component of a modern European empire, marking the end of one historical era while establishing foundations for the challenges and opportunities that would define its future within the broader Austrian imperial system.